It's the ERP Confab. I'm David Essex, Industry Editor at Informa Tech Target, with my colleagues, News Director Jim O'Donnell and Enterprise Applications Editor Brian McKenna. This month, SAP held its annual Sapphire conference, and there was no shortage of important technology and product news. SAP made a convincing case for its melding of cloud-based ERP, AI, and data into a whole greater than the sum of its parts, with the Joule Copilot omnipresent and able to automate hundreds of tasks. We summarize the biggest developments and give our take on what it all means, including my observations from attending the North American Sapphire in Orlando and Brian reporting from the European Sapphire in Madrid. So the US Sapphire conference was last week in Orlando. And Jim, we usually go together, but you had a wonderful family obligation that was preventing you from attending in Orlando. And so I went and did some of the news coverage. But you were able to write a preview piece and also watch the keynote virtually. So I thought it might be interesting if we start with you talking about what some of the analysts and others said to expect and what they wanted to see from SAP before the conference.
Basically, I think leading up to it, I talked to some analysts, some partners, and some customers about what they were expecting. The general theme was people were expecting SAP to sort of focus on their innovations in AI and Joule, of course, agentic AI throughout their applications. But I think they were really looking for sort of more practical use cases for customers. I think the general theme was, there's a lot of business uncertainty out there, and customers are really looking for SAP to kind of provide the tech and the applications that can really help businesses sort of have this more agile enterprise, applications that can help them deal with the problems that they're encountering right now. I'll be interested to hear from both you and Brian's reporting about what was the message that was conveyed from SAP, and did it sort of line up with the expectations of the customers and the analysts?
I think it did. That's the short answer. And you and I were talking the other day about how in your article, in your preview article, there was talk of SAP needing to position this in the context of tremendous economic uncertainty and to talk about how they might be able to help. And they have said in their analyst calls, I think, that they think that they're well positioned as such a global company to
Correct.
deal with tariffs and the uncertainty, because they have essentially money coming in from so many countries. And so sure enough, Christian Klein, the CEO, he absolutely did emphasize economic uncertainty and put that word uncertainty on the big screen as he was talking. There were quite a few pretty practical introductions in the sense that Joule, the Copilot, usually AI-powered Copilot,
Yep.
was really beefed up again and put in more of places within the suite, the business apps, doing really practical steps like tasks, or they call them skills, that Joule can help people with. They introduced 78 new use cases for Joule. There were already 100 that had been released before, so it was a really big beefing up, and they're on the way to 400. There's something they promised by the end of the year. They seem well on the way to that. And the other big news really was how they are, I think, responding to the practical needs, the problems of doing AI in a practical and safe way in business. And it comes down to data, quality of data, what kind of data you're putting in, whether it's good enough for the AI to train on. And so a big part of the story at Sapphire was also talking about their business data cloud, which was just released, or at least announced, only in February, just a few months ago, earlier this year. And they talked about further integration between Business Data Cloud and also putting some AI apps, such as something called, I think, People Intelligence, which is a human capital management app that works within Business Data Cloud, and really like a triumvirate, and they were calling it a flywheel. And I think I'll leave it for Brian, because we both highlighted that in our articles. So it was really I was pretty impressed, like a three-front effort to talk about the applications and AI, primarily through the Joule Copilot, and also the data story, which is really the big issue lately in AI that everyone's trying to solve now.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. So that was one of the, in watching sort of the keynote virtually, Christian Klein, the CEO, kind of introduced this concept of the flywheel. And maybe Brian, as Dave said, I think you're on the ground in Madrid. Maybe you can kind of explain it and sort of see what they're getting at with this flywheel that everything sort of is interrelated and makes things work.
Well, actually, David encapsulates the flywheel brilliantly in his story about it. We've joked about the flywheel of history. Um, so it's the idea of the, like David said, the troika of applications, data, and AI kind of going round faster and faster, and it's that motion that gives you that increases the business value. Yeah,
The idea is they're all sort of reinforcing each other as once the
reinforce each
flywheel
other.
gets moving, right?
Yeah, and then they add
Yes.
to each other as well. But it's just a concept, right? I mean, we'll be talking about the flywheel in a year's time. I mean, all the enterprise software vendors are talking about a triad of
Yeah.
applications,
Yeah.
data, and agents in the case of
Mhm.
Salesforce. So that's maybe not actually hugely unusual. So the event here in Madrid, there's a few differences. There's about 7,500 people here. There's about 11,000 people, I believe, in Orlando. So if you add them up, you get to 18,500, which must be on a par with how things were when
Hmm.
Yeah.
the Sapphire was just located in Orlando and
Mhm.
not really anywhere else. I'd like to come back to that uncertainty thing though, because I asked Christian Klein in the press and analyst Q&A after the keynote about, because he led on that. And I said, well, especially in a European context, and in terms of the conversations you're having with C-level executives, in terms of the tariff conflict with the United States, um, how are people reacting? And is this a wake-up call? Are they now speeding up their SAP adoption of things like Joule, moving to S/4HANA, maybe really, is it triggering them to go faster? Basically, was what my question was. And he essentially said yes, and that he looks forward to a time when the trade conflict will be history and we can, forget about it and move on. He said, so far, so good. And, but it's definitely trying times
Mhm.
for companies. SAP is quite well positioned because it's so good on supply chain, and that's what the tariff conflict with the Trump administration is necessitating companies to look afresh at their supply chains in the same way that they had to do during COVID. Not so much new things here. I mean, the new things announced today were really around customers. I've just spoken to a lady called Petra Scheither, who's in charge of, which has a global role at BASF. It's the world's leading, chemical chemical company, very strong in Germany. They have a long-standing relationship with SAP, and they're now beginning their move to S/4HANA through the program, through the RISE program. A couple of other customers also on the S4 journey, Amer Sports, a couple of others, Team Liquid, who are an esports venture, um, CAF, which is a kind of Spain-based transport company, been around for a long time, trains and buses and things like that, and also Heineken. Heineken are using. I've got developed an AI chatbot for to improve internal business processes. But I tell you an interesting thing, and this will maybe resonate with you, especially Jim, because you covered this story in the first place. Walk me. So I was talking to one of our analyst colleagues, Neil Ward Dutton, and he was saying that he sees real genius in the combination of WalkMe and Joule, and also Signavio and LeanIX. And interestingly, Petra from BASF, she said the same thing. she was really taken with the whole kind of WalkMe, the possibilities of WalkMe in combination with the Joule agents. And I know, Jim, you covered that acquisition originally when SAP bought that company.
I did, and that was announced a year ago. So I
Yeah.
wasn't really interested to find out. And maybe Dave, you were on the ground in in
Mhm.
Orlando when they announced it. But maybe you can kind of tell how that WalkMe integration. I believe it's like a sort of an answers bar essentially in Joule that provides context for what the user might be asking. How does it work?
I know a little bit about it. They talked about it a lot. And at one point, Christian Klein, it might have been in the Q&A that the folks assembled in Orlando went to, the media analyst crowd, said it's working out better than expected, the
Yeah.
WalkMe acquisition. So they have something called an action bar that is powered by WalkMe, which is, just to remind folks, it's a digital adoption platform that SAP acquired last year. It sits on usually different applications to guide users to help them remember how to do things.
Yeah.
But what this does is SAP said it enables Joule to study user behavior
Yeah.
across the applications. Joule, before this capability, it required prompts and guidance, but the action bar will enable Joule to operate more independently. And so, yeah, it was given a fair amount of attention, and it does seem like a clever thing, as Brian was saying. And also, it reminds me of just this bigger picture, which we've talked about
Yeah.
occasionally, of products like ServiceNow, other things that sit on
Hmm.
top of the applications, whether
Yep.
they be AI, whether they be this, like an employee portal that used to have an IT service management focus. But WalkMe is a little bit in that vein, something that, yet another layer but yet another layer that's trying to make it easier to interact with the so-called transactional system that is easier to use than ever, but still has a lot of steps and things that make it difficult for people to learn
Yeah.
how to use like an ERP system. So it's really kind of impressive how much things have changed, especially since we've been covering this.
It's omnipresent. I mean, that's the idea, isn't it? Will be
Yeah.
completely present across all the business
Hmm.
applications.
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that Neil Ward Dutton from IDC and Petra from BASF, from a user point of view, both independently were enthusing about WalkMe in the context of Joule and also with their LeanIX
Hmm.
um, architectural architectural thing, and Signavio, the business process mining and improvement. So it does look like a bunch of things coming together. And then with the drumbeat of the extension of more and more S4 HANA into the SAP customer base. For a company like BASF, which is a $70 billion company, immensely complex, global, well over 100,000 employees. I mean, been working with SAP for 40 years, hundreds of customizations in their SAP
Hmm.
environment. I mean, it's not trivial to be kind of making some of these moves. And again, she was excited by the AI possibilities as well.
Yeah. There's one other thing I'd like to talk a bit about, and I found this a little bit of a surprise. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that they introduced something called AI Foundation, which is really, for the most part, is a collecting together of existing tools
Hmm.
for developing AI
Hmm.
in-house.
Hmm.
And there's also an AI agent hub, which is basically putting the SAP's agents in one place so that people can map them better to their business processes. And so it allows more customization of Joule, more ways to bring in data packages that are on the business data cloud. It sounds a little bit like a platform play, and I actually asked Christian Klein about this, and he really emphasized more of the holistic story that was the main theme, the notion that no, that it's not just a platform play. There's all these co-pilots, there's all these skills and tasks now that are just being added every day practically, so that the AI can do practical things, which has certainly been the approach followed by Oracle, which I've emphasized over the years. And we've discussed this, I think, the three of us, that for a while, especially initially, the ERP vendors seemed to be going for an AI platform with a clever name like Einstein at
Hmm.
Salesforce or
Yeah.
Coleman at Infor. And then they moved away from that. And so this strikes me as basically SAP covering all the bases, having a platform and having the specific tools that do practical things more or less out of the box.
One other thing that I noticed from the announcements was that they were moving to this concept of the business suite, right? It seemed like they were repositioning S/4HANA Cloud, Ariba, Concur, these different applications, Fieldglass, as a business suite concept, which, it seems to me that they're kind of counteracting this best of breed message that's been going out for the last few years. And I think somebody had mentioned in one of the keynotes that the best of breed has, call it an iceberg effect, where you get to a point where you get blocked because of the silos, and the suite approach, which seems to be outdated, at least in concept, but maybe they're back to the future with the business suite concept.
Yeah, they had an actual term that they were pushing to try to bridge these two, and again, not make it so much of an either or thing, but also to claim that their suite now does have the best of the breed.
Right.
And so there was a term you heard, or that was stated, Jim. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that they used to capture the concept.
Yeah, I think it was Mohammed Alam, one of the executives. I think his quote that I heard was, "Best of breed is a thing of the past. Suite as a service is the AI future," which is a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean the keynote that Christian and Mohammed and the others gave today was pretty much the same keynote as they gave last week. There was just a few differences. That's all. I think last week Palantir made an appearance in the form of a video message from Alex Karp. That didn't happen in Madrid. They foregrounded Adobe, and then later this afternoon I've got the customer keynote, which will include BASF and some of the other customers that I mentioned earlier. Can I also say, let me just to kind of lighten things up a wee bit. Putting, the golf went quite well.
Right. Yes, the Orlando, it was the two captains of the Ryder Cup teams. So they had a putting contest with the two professional golfers and Christian Klein, right?
But this time, Christian got it in the hole.
Oh, he did?
He got the ball
wow.
in the hole, whereas apparently he didn't in Orlando.
No, he did not. He must have been practicing.
I was going to say, even though it wasn't in Germany, it was fairly close. Maybe home field advantage or something. He felt a little more comfortable in Spain. I just have one other thought about AI that I want to share, because I had an interesting conversation with a guy named Sean Kask, who is the Chief AI Strategy Officer for SAP. And he talked about the concept of a knowledge graph, which we are hearing from others. But it seems to be, based on how SAP described it, as really key to removing the notorious hallucinations that AI, especially generative AI, is prone to. And so Sean Cass talked about a huge knowledge graph, and it's built inside S/4HANA. He said it's 7.3 million fields, 452,000 tables, and some other technical objects. I'm not sure what those are. But it maintains the semantical context of the fields and the information, so that I guess that's to prevent the generative AI and Joule from going off too far in a tangent and making false assumptions. And he claims that with the knowledge graph, for example, if you have different purchase orders or different terminology, it matches it to the context, and that it's reducing hallucinations almost to zero. So I think we'll probably see more of this from all the ERP vendors and elsewhere in the enterprise apps world going forward, as they try to figure out how to apply AI to their suites. Just one other quick thought too about the suites. I was sort of making jokes about it with especially the SAP people and to some degree the analysts, because it's a very familiar term in the SAP world. It used to be the name for the package of optional modules that sat on top of ERP Central Component, or ECC, in the previous major ERP platform of SAP. And to bring it back and to apply it to all the cloud apps, not just S/4HANA, but as you mentioned, Jim, I think they're including Ariba, Concur, there are other acquired properties in there. So to some degree, it's a packaging gimmick, I'll say, but it reinforces what their message is, which is this is, according to them, a comprehensive logical troika or flywheel of apps, data, and AI that are integrated. And yet I have to point out also at the show, I was made aware of some integration that hasn't yet happened, for example, with Ariba. So To some degree, it's PowerPoint where, it's still aspirational because as often happens, and it's sometimes dismissed as typical when there is an acquisition, because it certainly happened with Oracle and a lot of the others that have acquired, like Infor, to not very quickly integrate the acquired properties, and yet they are presented as being very key to the suite, the perception of an integrated suite.
In the lead up to it, people I were talking to kind of mentioned that one of the themes always with the Sapphire is that SAP will sort of outlay this sort of bold quote unquote vision of where they're going, and it doesn't often sort of line up with what the customers are really looking for, and then there's, to a certain extent, they always have to do that. They always have to show what the roadmap is, where their innovation is. Did you get in talking to customers and talking to maybe partners at the shows and maybe now with Brian? Is this messaging hitting with the people with the issues on the ground?
I think it's landing. I'm still on day one of the European version of Sapphire, so
Yeah.
basing myself on what Petra from BASF had to say, I'd say so. I mean, then there's the customer keynote later, and those customer stories that I mentioned. They all seem to be in line with the vision, but as we know, the whole S/4HANA journey has been a long journey.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the users in the keynote this morning would have been maybe intrigued by Christian Klein's constant repetition of AI's driving a 30% uptick in SAP productivity. And I know he used that figure last week in Orlando as well. I mean, AI driving a 30% improvement in productivity. A lot of users would be very interested in getting that degree of productivity increase. Let's just put it that way.
Whenever we do our Sapphire wrap-up podcast, I like to ask where we think this leaves SAP, both in their own long history, now over half a century, and their sagas that have been going on regarding cloud migration, S/4HANA migration, and then all the vendors now trying to not miss the boat on AI and really turn it into some meaningful products. I'm wondering where you think this latest Sapphire and the announcements and what's coming in the next few months, where it leaves them competitively.
I can make an anecdotal observation there, David, which might be helpful. I was speaking to Gerard Decker, one of the co-founders of Signavio, who's obviously in the SAP senior leadership these days. Just speaking very, very informally, and he was telling me about how he had been one of Hasselplattner's students at the Potsdam Institute. So that's quite an and he was talking about hanging out with Hassel, the other students, going for pizza and beer and shooting the breeze and things like that. So there you've got like one of the co-founders of SAP, one of the co-founders of Signavio, who was a student at that time, is today in the senior leadership of SAP. I mean, this is a business which has quite an impressive kind of longevity about it, I think, passing the baton and things like that. And even Christian Klein, who's been at SAP, I think all of his career.
Yes.
As a very young CEO, and maybe I've got no right to say this, but he really seems more and more comfortable all the time in that role. So
Absolutely.
if that's helpful as an observation. Yeah.
Yeah, that was an observation a number of folks had in Orlando.
One of the hallmarks of that is Christian Klein was just extended his contract, so obviously the board thinks that he's the right person to have. So it's that stability that I think that is there with the company, but the innovations they're doing with Joule being infused into everything and moving to this suite concept, I think it's positioning them pretty well. And I think the inevitable sort of perennial question is the installed base that's still on the on-premises. Are they, will they start to move now more rapidly because of AI is proving sort of it's got an inevitable force of it, right? So I think that there's companies that are going to be saying, why didn't I start moving, years ago to take advantage of some of these innovations that are happening?
Yeah, and even though there's limited ability as I understand it, if you still have some on-premises things, to do some extension into the cloud. And in fact, one of the vendors who's involved in AI I spoke to at Orlando was alluding to that. It's still clear. They certainly, the partners and vendors want to follow SAP into the cloud, and I think it's been well established elsewhere that to really do AI the way people are envisioning, it's going to be in the cloud. So I guess it does look like another incentive to move to S/4HANA Cloud and the suite, as I say it. I'll just add one final thought about where I think this positions them. Often when I've gone to the Oracle Cloud World and previous to that Open World conference, either in person or virtually, I've often been impressed by how they seem to be making AI more practical and weaving it into the workflow. And I feel like maybe it's a numbers game and maybe Oracle still has more, but it looks to me like SAP has the whole picture, and especially with the platform, the AI foundation, and then all these other pieces, most of which are in the cloud now. It is a pretty impressive story, and yet I also want to add, it's still a story. There's a reality behind that story, and then some of it is still aspirational, and I think we still need to see how much they can really piece this together and what the practical reality is for customers to be using the different pieces of the suite and trying to integrate AI in an intelligent way. Well, as always, this has been great. I think we have our own powerful flywheel going here, if I may be so bold, or some kind of troika.
A troika.
We got the old crowd together. So I thank both of you again for talking on the ERP Confab.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Brian.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jim. Pleasure as always.